Wait for an introduction, or I just kind of go?
Let's see. Wasn't being here today yet. Okay, all right. This is Dr. M. Daniel Carroll Wallace, and he's the Blanchard Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College in Oregon. He's already delivered 3 lectures before. And in 50 minutes, there will be a chance for questions and answers.
Thank you. Okay, so this is my 4th lecture. I can do it. Okay. Kind of like Moses, you know, if you hold up my arms. Okay. Okay, all right. That's why I have coffee. All right. So we've actually looked at several things. The first lecture, which was at 9 o'clock this morning, was just setting some prolegomena in place to even think about doing Old Testament ethics. Issues about how you approach the discipline, how you approach the Bible, and how you begin to think about how to use that ancient text for today's world. That was the first lecture. Second lecture, we tried to set the theological basis for ethics. And so we looked at creation and the fall. We live in a world created good by God. But then we saw what happened with sin in the fall, and how the Old Testament describes that what comes with the fall is violence and death. And so we live in a world of death and darkness. So into that, we talked last time, Genesis 12 and the rest of the narrative in Genesis, about how we respond to that with mission, to be a blessing. To the world, the blessing will be material and it will be spiritual. And so you begin to see that the ethical dynamic is part and parcel of being a blessing to the world. And the important thing I would say is this, is that you can't separate the material and the spiritual. That's very clear in the Genesis narrative. Oftentimes in our churches, we will separate them. You see, or what we'll do is say, oh, those people over there, they do the justice thing. Get that kind of bifurcation. But what we see in the Old Testament text is that that's never separated. It all goes together. You cannot separate faith and good works, if I can use that language. James, right? You tell me you have faith, well, show me your works. That's very much of an Old Testament idea. If you don't have works, meaning good deeds, justice, things like this, then I doubt that you even believe. Because the God of the universe demands that his people live ethical lives and are a blessing to the world. So, what I want to do in this last lecture, and if my voice holds, we'll see, is to talk about the prophets. This is the part of the Old Testament that we often just ignore, because it's not a very pleasant place to be. I mentioned earlier in the day that sometimes for Christmas, we'll kind of go to the prophets for some predictions about Jesus, and fair enough, Messiah is coming. But when we get to the prophets, we find a very confrontational kind of world, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Now, when we get to the prophets, there's actually several ways of studying the prophets. And sometimes what you can do is comparative studies. Look at the ancient Near East. Because you find some of the same kind of things that the Old Testament is interested in. You find it in ancient literature of the time. So issues of poverty and widows, moving boundary stones, things like this. This isn't unique to ancient Israel. It's not unique to any society. Actually, these are the woes of any society in the history of the world. You're going to have widows, you're going to have orphans, you're going to have poor people, you're going to have issues about property and the mistreatment of prisoners or things like this. So you find these kinds of issues even in ancient law codes. It's not unique to Israel. Now, what is unique to Israel is how you approach those issues and how you provide solutions. Okay, that's where you begin to see the difference. But when you get to ancient literature that is prophetic literature, that's where you see a large difference, because as far as I know, and I've done some study, is of all the prophetic literature that we have, and it's Assyrian, from Mari and then in the 7th century, of all the prophetic literature that we have from the ancient world, there's only 2 texts, what we would call 2 verses, that actually talk about social ethics. When you find prophetic critiques in the ancient Near Eastern literature, and they're critiquing the king, it's usually about they haven't kept the temple up, they haven't repaired it, and the god or the goddess is angry. But in terms of social critique, we only have a couple of passages, and they're very general. So what we have in the prophets is very unique in terms of the emphasis on social ethics. You don't see that in the ancient Near East. It doesn't mean they don't have social concerns, but their prophetic literature looks very different than ours. So you can do that comparative approach, and that's informative. What you can also do is look at social science approaches, and we talked a little bit about that earlier this morning, where now you're talking about, so what were, coffee's a good thing. What were the mechanics of oppression in ancient Israel? How did the economics work? How did the politics work? What were the social structures of ancient Israel that caused all these problems? And you have a number of studies that have been done and different theories that have been done to try to get at the particulars of the prophetic critique. Whether they be social, political, religious, issues of military, fortresses, armies, regional and international networking of economics, all these things, once you begin to see them in the text, they're there. And these social science approaches can help us find them, even though there's different ideas about what's actually being said. At least these social science approaches are making it more live and more real to us. And we can get beyond just the general kind of ideas. Another thing that we'll get back to actually is kind of cultural anthropology and sociology of knowledge. Because, I'll give you an example. Every culture constructs itself. So it's called the social construction of reality in anthropology, cultural anthropology. Now, what happens if this is the only thing you know, this is normal, this is natural. And it's all kinds of things. It's how you dress. It's how you talk. If you have an accent or don't have an accent, it's what you eat. And let me give you a couple of stories. So, food. That's a cultural marker. So, when I was at Denver Seminary before I went to Wheaton, and so what I would do is I would take students from Denver to Guatemala about every other year. And in Guatemala, black beans are a staple. Tres tiempos, right? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we eat black beans. And we can do black beans, I'm half Guatemalan, if you don't know that. We can do black beans any way you want. We can do frijol parado, the whole bean. We can do arroz con frijol. We can do, beans and rice. We can do bean soup. We can do frijol volteado. That's where you kind of mash it all up and you fry it and you flip it on the frying pan. That's why it's volteado. And it looks like a meatloaf. And then you slice it. And then you get the white goat cheese that's dried. And you put it on it. And salsa para chuparse los dedos. Good stuff. And so, when I was a kid and we go to school, what you would take as a snack was pan con frijol, a bean sandwich. That was the snack. So I would tell my students, okay, we're going to Guatemala, we're going to be eating beans, you need to be in training for this. Because beans do things. And so, I'm just warning you. Dr. Carroll, we go to Chipotle, we can do this. Qdobas. Okay. It was clockwork. I'd always get there a few days early. I'd receive them on a Saturday evening. Wednesday morning. It was always Wednesday morning. That was the time when things would begin to happen. And it was, Dr. Carroll, for the love of God, can we go to McDonald's, please? And what I would do on that Wednesday night, I'd say, tonight's pizza night. It's on me, Because right outside the seminary, there was a Domino's Pizza walk-in. You couldn't sit there and eat, you just walk in. I'd say, okay, pizza's on me, we'll watch a movie. Don't you girls great? Okay. Now, it's actually changed, sadly, because my sadistic self just really enjoyed this, because Guatemala was probably the only place in the world at the time where you could get black bean pizza. So I'd buy some pizzas, and then, you know, the small one on the top, right? So you'd open up, right? The food. See, how do you know you're in an Hispanic neighborhood? The restaurants. The food. If you're visiting someone who's from another culture, what do they want to share with you? Their food. See? So it's not strange, actually, when you get into the Old Testament, part of what it means to be an Israelite is their food. That is a marker. Okay? So you're going to find that. But, you know, besides cultural markers like that, what you also have are kind of things that we just take for granted. Like, for instance, why do we drive on the right-hand side of the road? See? So we lived in Britain for 2.5 years, and, you know, it's the other side. They think we're strange, right? But you think about it, what we do, you know. It's this rite of passage in this country. So you go to school for this. And to get a license, awesome. And so you have to learn all these shapes, like octagonal shapes and rectangular shapes and triangles, right? And color code them. So octagonal has to be red, which means stop. Who came up with that? Why is octagonal red means stop? Not an Anderson. Must be a lot of Latino people here. So you know, we go to school for this, right? And this is like this great event in our lives when we pass the driving test. In Britain, it's actually more difficult. They will give you your test as you drive, and if you make one mistake, you fail. So if you go to a card shop, there's actually cards for passing the driving test. I remember years ago, do you remember the name Princess Di, Diana? Okay, so we were there when she was alive. And, you know, all these books would come out about her life. And it actually talked about how she was so proud because she got her license on the 6th try. Okay. So why did we start doing it on the right-hand side of the road? Was it like, we're Americans and those Brits, they do it on the left, so we're going to do it on the right, because that's American? I don't know. But we have all these kinds of signs and insurance and police, and if you don't do it just right, you know. So what you find is that we begin to construct our world. Like, why do we wear white for weddings? Well, that's just what you do. Well, why? That's just what you do. Okay? And you have all these things. And so if someone walks in to a wedding with a black miniskirt, it's like, oh my gosh, look at what she's wearing. That's just wrong. Well, why? Well, everybody knows. So we construct our world, how we do birthdays, you know, all these things. So what you find in the Old Testament is the same kind of thing. When they leave Egypt, they go in the middle of nowhere, and God gives them a blueprint for another culture. Their food, how they dress, it's all in there. Whom they marry, whom they shouldn't marry, how to raise their kids, how to treat their animals, what to do with dead people, what to do with property, what do you do with theft, what do you do with murder, what do you do with incest. That's all in the law. Now what happens with Christians sometimes, we go, law is about sin, Jesus died for sin, law bad. It's kind of the... If you look at the law anthropologically, you have an alternative culture. In Egypt, they used to mistreat the poor and actually put them into forced labor. We won't treat our poor that way. In Egypt, Pharaoh was God. Deuteronomy 17. The king will not accumulate women, a harem. Will not accumulate horses, an army. It will not accumulate wealth. What were the three great signs of a powerful king in the ancient world? Women, armies, and wealth. No. And then it says in Deuteronomy 17, and the king will have his copy of the law, and he will read it every day. And then it says, so that he will not think of himself as better than anybody else. That is so countercultural in the ancient world. So what you see then is the creation of cultures going on, even in the Old Testament text. So if we go to cultural anthropology, it actually helps us understand what we're reading. How they understand reality, how they understand ideologies. What is called by Charles Taylor, the sociologist, the social imaginary, all that's changing. So the social sciences can help us get at it all. Another one is psychology. I wrote an article years ago on Micah in the emotions of social justice. In the Old Testament prophets, you find them, they're very angry. Because the injustice triggers anger. Not only the prophetic anger, divine anger. But also what you find, this is fascinating too, there's a whole new area of study in Old Testament studies on emotions. The emotions of God. He gets angry. But you also see him grieving and lamenting the condition of his people. Even as he moves to judgment, it talks about in the text how he grieves to do this. And all the emotions of it all. I'll give you an example. Jonah. You know the story of Jonah? Yes? Okay. All right. Never sure this crowd. This is a very quiet crowd. This is like the quiet holiness revival I've ever met. Okay. But if you remember, oftentimes we misread the text. So, God, talks to Jonah and he says, get up and go to Nineveh and preach against it because its evil has come up before me. And if you read the text, it depends on your version, because sometimes they change it a bit. It says, and Jonah got up. God had said, get up. He got up, thrown away. Why is he doing that? Well, if you know your Old Testament, when it says, preach against Nineveh because its evil has come up before me, if you know your Old Testament, that's Sodom and Gomorrah. So the Old Testament reader would say, well, God is telling him then to go preach judgment against Nineveh. That's what it's telling him to do. So why does he run away? See, Assyria, the great enemy of Israel, you would think that's what he would want to preach. Judgment. And he runs away. Interesting story. And I'd love to tell you all the particulars, but I'm going to jump. I wish I could just, if we have time, I'll come back and tell you the rest of the in-between parts. But what you have is this interesting thing in Jonah, because the captain comes down and he says, oh my gosh, he says, we're in this storm and everyone's calling their God and none of them are responding. Maybe your God will respond. And then Jonah says, well, I know it's my fault. And my God, Yahweh, he says, is the creator of heaven and the seas, and he will calm this storm. Well, the captain believes him. And he says, what have you done? What have you done to make the God so angry? What shall we do? And Jonah says, well, throw me overboard, and the sea will grow calm. Well, they go, well, okay. They try to not do that. But what he's told them is, my God demands human sacrifice. That makes sense to them. But they row and they try not to do that because they said, when they call out to Yahweh at the end, they say, please don't, if we've made a mistake, don't put this innocent blood on our hands. Because in the ancient world, innocent blood on your hands would be terrible. It brings judgment. So they want to be innocent of whatever. If this man must die, it's not our fault. And so they throw him overboard, and the sea grows calm, and then they begin to pray, and they offer vows to Yahweh, and they sacrifice to Yahweh. Okay, and he goes into the fish, he comes out. And then he begins to speak, and he says, 40 days, and Nineveh will be destroyed. If you compare the message of Jonah to the sailors, to whom he gave the name of his God, and he described his God, to the Ninevites, he just 40 days, and this will be destroyed. Doesn't even mention God. The decree. And he says, who knows? The God, they don't even know his name, the God may yet relent, and we might not perish. And he calls for everyone to put on sackcloth and ashes and fast. And God sees how they had turned, it's interesting in the Hebrew, how they had turned from their evil, and he turned from his evil, which was the evil of judgment. And then Jonah responds, and now we know why he was angry. Angry enough to die, he says. I knew you were like this, and that's why I ran. I knew you would forgive them. See, he would rather die than have them forgiven. He wants them to die. But do you see the emotions of it? Angry enough to die. And in the last line of the book, what does Yahweh say? He says, look, you had compassion on this plant. Should I not have compassion on this 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left? In the Hebrew, it says that. You know, your version might say right from wrong, but it says left hand, right hand. They don't know. See, the only one in the book who knows is Jonah. I know that it's because of me that this storm has come. I knew you were like this, but they don't know. Interesting. Jesus on the cross, what does he say? Father, forgive them, they do not know. Oh, they knew. The Roman soldiers knew, but they didn't. The compassion of God, even for the cruelest empire in the history of the ancient world. The emotions, the psychology of it all. Fascinating stuff. Literary approaches. And I want to sit here for a while. The role of rhetoric, and now we're talking about the world of the text. And now we're talking about how to read the text. And I want to begin. Coffee's good, but it makes my mouth dry, so. The most famous book in Spanish literature begins like this. En un lugar de la Mancha, de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme, no ha mucho tiempo que vivía un hidalgo, de los de lanza en astillero, adarga antigua, rocín flaco y galgo corredor. That's how the novel El ingenuoso Hidalgo Don Quijote de la Mancha. That's how it begins. Miguel de Cervantes, Saavedra. The most famous novel in Spanish literature begins with that line. You read a Dickens novel, and every Christmas we even do, a Christmas carol. We totally misunderstand it. We kind of make it fun, you see. And I'm a Dickens guy. I was an English lit major, and so I love Dickens and Milton and Shakespeare. I love Latin American literature. This one, the Spaniard, Cervantes, but Gabriel García Márquez and Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, the Guatemalan Nobel Prize winner Miguel Ángel Asturias. And what they do is they create these worlds, a Christmas carol. See, we even know it so well that it's become part of the English language. Oh, don't be a Scrooge. We know what that means. But we don't understand that A Christmas Carol is actually powerful commentary on 19th century London. The poverty, the greed, the suffering of families. And what Dickens would do, apparently he had a photographic memory, and he would disguise himself at night. And he would go into the alleyways of London, into the whorehouses, into the inns, into all these different places. And he creates the characters. And there's this scene where his daughter describes how she pretended to be asleep on the couch in his office, and he had a full-length mirror. And what he would do is he would act it out, you see, and he would do all the accents, and he would write it out like that. And he'd run over to his table, and then he'd come back to the mirror, and he'd all act it out, you see. Create this world. Mid-19th century London, 1843, is A Christmas Carol. At the same time in London, there is another man writing about the times. His name is Karl Marx. He's in London at the very same time, analyzing the world of nascent industrial England and coming up with a different analysis and a different solution, isn't he? So what you begin to see is that this literature in its scenes, in its characters, in its speech, begins to create a world, the world of the text, that we need to learn how to read again. And now, in the prophetic literatures, we'll see fascinating metaphors and descriptions. But then what you have, a lot of it's anonymous. Woe to those who... no name. So what you have are behaviors. Woe to those who oppress the poor. Woe to those who sell them for silver. And what you have are participles of behavior. It's kind of like when you go into Proverbs. The wise man, the fool, the sluggard. See? You're getting character types. The same thing in the prophets. You'll get a few names, maybe a name of a king, or maybe an opposing prophet, or maybe a priest or something, but it's very anonymous, which makes it able to cross the centuries, and we can pull it into our own world because we know people like that. We've seen people like that. We can give that participle a name. That's why we don't know what to do with Leviticus. Oh my gosh, there's so many details, we don't know what to do with it. So as good Christians, we just make it Jesus. Right? Or all the furniture of the temple. It's Jesus. You see, we just kind of do that because we don't know what to do. See, but the prophets live because in many ways they are anonymous in their characters, but their characters live. That's why if you teach Bible, you got to be a good storyteller. I tell my students, I can't do it now. I'm in the grad school. Okay, but when I was doing survey classes, they don't know how to read anymore, right? So I would just say, when you teach the Bible, you got to know when to get angry, and really angry. Just like the text gets really angry. But then you need to know when to whisper, like the text does. In the ancient world, we think in ancient Israel, less than 10% of the people could read. They would hear, they would listen. You had to be a good storyteller. And the literature reads as great stories. The metaphors just come alive. What does this do to the teaching of ethics? Oh my gosh! It's not about, all these kind of, this that happens and then if someone... No, you see the ethics just coming out of the text, the prophetic text, and the word is alive. The world of the text, which takes you to the world, I'm jumping ahead, in front of the text. And that's the encounter of the world of the text in my world. See, what is the world in front of the text? See, how does it engage my world? Now, this is where we go back to the very first lecture that we had. If this is the Word of God, and I believe that it is, how does its world impact my world? Because it should. If I believe it is the Word of God, then its world must tell me how to live my world. And one of the things that it does, the imagination, it gives me a new lens. If you read Don Quixote de la Mancha, he's a crazy man. But as you read the text, you begin to see that he actually understands everything. And he exposes the greed and the cruelty of the world around him, even in his quote-unquote craziness. And we know from Cervantes' own life that it was a massive social critique, you see, at the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition. Oh, put it into its historical context. Dickens, his make-believe world is so real. The characters just pop out of the page. So what you're beginning to see is this encounter. This is why, I'm a big mystery novel person. I only collect certain ones. So there's this woman in Chicago. She writes about this detective. It's a woman detective on the South Side. Sarah Paretsky is her name. Right? So I have several authors that I just buy their books. I mean, it's kind of like an addiction. You know, it comes out once a year, you've got to buy it. And I'm a hardcover guy. I can't do paperbacks. So they fleece me. Because every year there's a new book. I'm, yes, and I need a hardback. It's actually true. I mean, like my wife will get paperbacks. Paperbacks do not make it onto my shelves. I'm just the hardbacks. But if you read a mystery novel, and it's a good one, and you're into it, now, you can jump ahead to the very last chapter, because they always end the same. They're all sitting in a room, and the detective explains to everyone how they caught the bad guy, right? Now, a good mystery writer, you don't know until the end. So when you're reading it, you want to figure it out, but you really don't, because if you do, then you kind of ruin the book, and then you just can't do it. I mean, so you got this thing going on, the whole mystery novel thing, right? You've got to let the text work on you. To enter into the text, into the life of the characters. And then, you find yourself dreaming about these things. Oh, why don't we read the text of the Bible that way? It's powerful literature for the ages. So what I want to do is spend a little time in Amos. I've got 15 minutes. If you have a text, if you go to Amos chapter 1, let me just highlight some things. Amos chapter 1. Verse 2. The Lord, or Yahweh, roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, and the top of Carmel withers. Now it's interesting because you see, Amos is from Tekoa, which is in Judah. But he's actually speaking in Israel, in the northern kingdom. Now you have to understand the ideology of the ancient world. If you were to go to a country or an empire, there would be a capital city, and in the capital city you would have the national palace, and you would also have the temple of the god. And in Hebrew, the word for temple is the same word for palace, heikal. Because, you see, the temple is the palace of the god. And they're structured this way. So you'll have kind of a broader area, then you'll get to, if we're talking about the temple in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies, well, in the ancient world, that would have been the throne room. And Yahweh sits on the ark. The ark is the footstool of his throne. Okay? Very ancient Near Eastern. And so you have the wedding of the temple and the palace. The god or the goddess supports the king. In fact, the king is the son of God. In Egypt, Pharaoh was God, but in the other countries, oftentimes, the king was the son of the god, whoever it might be. But from the very first verse here, Amos is saying, Yahweh is in Judah. He's roaring not from Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. He's roaring from Jerusalem. From the very first verse of the book, he is saying, this whole social construction of reality and the politics it is built on and the society that you've created that you say Yahweh supports, it's a fraud. Yahweh isn't even here. And the temple at Bethel is a temple that he will destroy. That's how the book will end in chapter 9. He will tear the temple of Bethel down. From the very beginning, what you have is Amos attacking the social construction of reality, the national social imaginary about what Israel was and the rule of God in it. And then he begins to talk about all the countries that have been so cruel in warfare for 3 sins of Damascus or for 3 sins of Tyre or on and on. Or for 4, I will not call back the judgment. And then he'll actually include Israel in that, in the Israel oracle in chapter 2. For 3 sins, no 4 of Israel I will not cause it to come back. And he talks about how they have mistreated the poor. Now, in the other countries, it was about cruelty and warfare. With Israel, it's about cruelty in society. But he lumps them together with all the nations of the world. And if the judgment on the nations of the world that surrounds Israel is a judgment of military defeat, it's exactly the same judgment Israel will face for its own sins, is military defeat. But you see, aren't we a powerful country? Don't we have fortresses? Oh. At the end of chapter 2, verses 14 to 16, he talks about 7 different kinds of soldiers who will run, who will flee that day. 7 different kinds of soldiers, you see, perfect defeat. And they're running away. Oh, the mighty armies of Israel will run on that day. In chapter 3, he even calls in verse 9 the other countries to come to this hill surrounding Samaria and to watch what's going on inside because God will judge them. And he will bring down their fortresses, and an army will surround Samaria and tear down the fortresses. And the rich houses of ivory will be destroyed at the end of chapter 3. And even the women in chapter 4, verse 1, who say, bring us more wine so that we might drink. Oh, they will go through the walls, verse 3, into exile. He is bringing the whole social construction in their imaginary to the ground. Then what he says beginning in chapter 4, verse 4. Odd what he does, but it makes beautiful sense. Go to Bethel and sin. Go to Gilgal and sin yet more. What? Bring your burnt offerings and bring your tithes. And then he says something, and your free will offerings. Then he says something that's just fascinating, but he gets to the core. Because he says, well, this is what you love to do. You see? They're very religious. They love to do this. But what he's saying is, this isn't me. This is what you love to do. And then if you look at the Hebrew, when you go from verse 5 to verse 6 in chapter 4, it's actually connected with a conjunction. So actually 6 connects to 5. Because, They had brought him these things, verses 4 and 5. But then he says in verse 6, but I have brought you cleanness of teeth, meaning hunger. I have brought you drought. I have brought you, you see, pestilence in your crops. I have brought you, verse 10, the death of your young men in battle. And I've done all these things. And the refrain 5 times in that section is, yet you did not return to me. Now, watch what happens. In the ancient world, where would you find God? At the sanctuaries. But what he says, when you go to the sanctuaries, when you go to church, you're actually sinning. That's what you call worship, I call sin. And what we see, now you begin to see how this works in our world. Maybe, I don't know your denomination. If you look in verses 4 and 5, none of those things that he mentions have anything to do with sin. They are all celebration and thanksgiving offerings in verses 4 and 5. And then you go to verse 6 to 11 and you're going, there's nothing to be thankful for. We're talking hunger, drought, crops that are destroyed, and our young people dying in war, and the stench is rising up to our noses, he says. The bodies are rotting on the battlefield. There's nothing to be thankful for. What you have is the separation of religious life from the realities of the real world. I don't know how many times I see that in churches. The church has nothing to do with real life. It's all about praising God. God is good all the time. God is good all the time. Have you heard that one? Everyone, let's all stand up, right? Nobody sad this morning. Really? That's why I came to church. I need some answers. We won't even go there. And what we look for in a church is an existential experience to make us feel good. If I can feel good for this hour, I'm good to go. And I have no answers for anything. You see how the prophets begin to live. And then what he says in verse 12. ¿Me puedes tomar una foto? Solo para que tenga. This looks like really narcissistic, but it's not. I just want a picture. Okay. And then he says, beginning in verse 12 of chapter 4, prepare to meet your God. And they would have said, well, we meet him all the time. No, you don't. I'm not at your sanctuaries. Prepare to meet your God. And then in verse 13, he begins to describe the power of the God who is coming. And then you get into chapter 5, verse 1, and it's a lament over Israel. God weeps over his people because he knows what's coming. Do you see how this begins to cover and to translate over the centuries? The imagination of Amos now lives for today. It comes to a head in chapter 7. I've got 5 minutes. It comes to a head in chapter 7, where the high priest says this, verse 13. This is the sanctuary of the king and the temple of the kingdom. Exactly. That's how it worked in the ancient world. And if you critique the religion, you critique the government. If you critique the government, you're critiquing the religion. It goes hand in hand. And so what does Amaziah tell Amos? Get out! So you're a foreigner. What business have you to tell us anything? Go back to Judah and earn your bread there. And so the prophet will say, oh, thus saith the Lord, your wife will become a whore in the city, probably Samaria. Your children will die, probably in the war. And you'll be taken away to an unclean land, and there you will die. because he, above all else, should have known better. And the guilt of the people falls upon the high priest because he had sold the truth of the God of Israel for political gain. Oh, fascinating stories. Right before that, I've got two more things in Amos, and then my time will be up. But I hope you're feeling this, you see. In chapter 7, verses 7 to 9. Now, this is going to go through, against, centuries of preaching. It says that the Lord was standing by a wall. Now, what you have in translations for centuries was a plumb line. That's not what it says in Hebrew. It's anak. We didn't even know what the word meant till about 30 years ago. Everyone just, it's a wall, and he's got something in his hand, plumb line. It means tin, T-I-N, tin. And what he's saying is this: Yahweh, or the Lord, is standing by a wall of tin. And he takes tin in his hand, and he throws it among his people. Now, what's going on? If you had read earlier in the book, and all the pride in their fortresses. See, from a distance, the wall may have looked like a wall of iron. Well, it's powerful and strong. Oh, but you know what? Appearances fool you. Just like they fooled you in the temple. Just like the king isn't all that he purports to be. This wall of iron is really a wall of tin. We use the same idea in English language, at least my generation. We would talk about tin soldiers. Weak soldiers. Just tin soldiers. Because tin is very weak. It's a wall of tin. It's all a farce. You can't be protected. And that's why in 7:9 he talks about how it's all coming down. See, he's dismantling the social imaginary. And then beginning in chapter 9, verse 11 to 15, he says, someday the fallen tabernacle of David will rise. The monarchy will rise again, but the monarchy is in the south. It will be a Davidic monarchy, not Jeroboam's line. And I'll rebuild its ruins and wall up its breaches. And the nations will come under my name, and there will be food to eat and wine to drink. You'll never be taken out of this land again. You see, when you talk about ethics, it's not only about what's wrong, but the hope for what can be right. The German theologian Jürgen Moltmann's done a lot of work on this. For decades he's worked on this. A recent book he just published called Ethics of Hope. If you work with people in a hospital or something, you have to give them hope, otherwise they give up. It's the same thing in the Old Testament. See, the prophets are preaching the end of the world as they knew it. The armies of Assyria would come, the armies of Babylon would come, and it will destroy, or they will destroy everything. But seek Yahweh and live. You may not survive the war, but on the other side, it'll be different. After the war, we'll rebuild. In El Salvador, that's what they would talk about. World War II, the Marshall Plan. It was about rebuilding the ruins. Japan, after the atomic bombs, repairing the ruins. If you were in Syria today, right, what would you say? One day we will rebuild the ruins. And one day our children will not die. And we'll have food to eat. And wine to drink. And you believe and you hope and you endure. This is ethics too. Now you begin to see how the prophets just give us a whole new window. It's not just about prophetic critique. It's about prophetic hope. And the hope is very ethical. A different king. The wars will end. And the children will not be born to misery anymore. We'll have food to eat and wine to drink. And we can grow our own food and plant our crops. And we can live in our own homes. Good stuff. You know, I tell people, you know, the Old Testament's amazing. The Old Testament's boring. Oh, good night. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is good stuff. If we just learn to tell the stories again. So, my time is up. As of a minute ago. So, I don't know what we do now. We break for questions, or how do we do this? Do you want to take a break before questions, or we just go right to questions?
Do you need a break, or can we go straight to the questions? Okay, no break. This is a time to that product.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes. Yes.
I always ask the question, who is the prophet?
Right.
And I get answers like the man, the fish, the bush, the worm. But the true answer is storyteller, such as us. Because Jonah's never called a prophet.
No. You know, he's called a prophet in 2 Kings. But what's interesting, I didn't get to this, but the book ends with a question. And Jonah never answers the question. We don't know how he answered the question. We don't know if he ever went back. So what happens with Jonah, is that the question now is left to the reader. It's kind of like when you get to the last verse of Hosea. Right? You've had this message and all this, and then at the very last line it says, do you understand this? Because the wise will understand. So basically what the prophet is doing is he's turning to the audience and saying, did you get it? So you get this kind of interactive thing going on with some of the literature as well, which is fascinating. Yeah, but Jonah's it's one of the most misunderstood books. I use it when I'm teaching about race. You know, because sadly in this country you can use examples like, you know, Ku Klux Klan, things like this, you see, angry enough to die or kill. We don't want them in our schools. We don't want them to marry our children. We don't want them in the same stores. Boom, boom, boom. You see?
Great exaggerations.
Yeah.
Like the city being 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Nineveh's a pretty big city. So if we do take it kind of in a literal sense, the idea is that he spent 3 days walking around it. So that's one way of getting at it. But yeah, I mean, the book is built on exaggeration, but that's how he makes the point. Yeah. Another thing is that people, okay, I'll give you my reading of the text. In chapter 2, in the prayer, there's no repentance. And, you know, it says, you know, when I get back to the temple, you're supposed to be going to Nineveh. He says, and those who follow false idols will forfeit the chesed of God. Yeah, but in chapter 1, it was the sailors who were actually praying to God. I mean, he's got it all backwards, you know. So it's a fascinating book, yeah. You know, most people think of VeggieTales or something. So it's a little deeper than that. Any other questions? Complaints?
The whole thing was being about using the Old Testament to write analysis.
Right.
Some may actually suggest that using religion to construct ethics, which how can one construct is ethics in the way in which you see necessarily dependent on other ways of constructing an ethic for the 21st century? There's a lot of violence in the human.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion. Yeah, I would say several things to begin to answer your question. Can ethics be done apart from the Christian faith? Well, of course it can. Has been from the beginning of time. I mean, the Assyrians had their ethic, Babylonians had their ethic. I mean, so you're talking about ancient culture, so does it have to be the Christian faith? No, it doesn't have to be. Humans, I think, have an ethical impulse because they're made in the image of God, so I think humans will actually try to do what they think is right and then punish those who don't. I mean, so I think that's very much of a human impulse. What I find is helpful, there was an article written by a man called Aiken. It's called Levels of Moral Discourse. It was published like in 1962 or something. But he talks about levels of moral discourse that help me, because he talks about the most fundamental level is expressive. We'll be at a football game and we're all kind of cheering and we're all kind of the mob mentality. We can respond to something, right, and do something at this expressive shared cultural level. It's very kind of earthy. The next level would be kind of the rules. And culturally we can do this. We'll have some agreement with the culture around us about what's right, what's wrong. So we can actually engage them. Okay? Now you get to the next level, it's the principles behind the rules. Now at that level, now you're beginning to see more differences, because let's say a Muslim about monogamous marriage, okay? One man, one woman. Okay, so we can maybe agree on that rule, but the principle that they would explain it by would be not my principle. But I still can work with them on that. See, I was, for instance, involved in this dialogue for several years with Catholics and evangelicals for the common good. That's what it was called. And so we came around to talk about poverty, pro-life, abortion, and immigration. We could agree on the Catholic Church and those three things. And so there we were. We were agreeing on the rules level, and the principle level we had some agreement because we all kind of came from a Christian thing. But there'd be a space where we can't go there. I mean, where in terms of church dogma of the Catholic Church, for instance, that I am a separated brethren, right? Because I'm not a Catholic. So there'd be a level where, you know what, finally we'll just have to kind of part. I was at another meeting, another Catholic dialogue with evangelicals in the World Evangelical Alliance, which is an association of associations globally of evangelicals. And there was 4 people from the Vatican office, and Avery Dulles, who was the premier Catholic theologian of the time, he's now dead, and a couple more Catholics, one from Colombia, and one was an ecumenical missionary. And then there were those of us on the evangelical side. And those of us from Catholic backgrounds of Latin America and France were a bit like this, the Catholic Church, because there's 500 years of history here, which North America cannot understand. And so we were talking, and so I asked the men from the Vatican, I said, so ultimately, for us to work with you at the deepest level, we would have to agree to come under the Bishop of Rome. And he said, yes. Perfect sense if you know Catholic dogma. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. You see, so what you do is you go up these levels, you begin to see that we can agree, And then at the top level, you see, or the ultimate differences. So what I would say is, as Christians engage the larger culture, is to begin to understand where the points of agreement are and how far we can agree. And in some things, we might not agree on, and that's where we'll part our ways. Or maybe even if we agree, for instance, I believe in immigration reform. But let's say, somebody goes, oh, we're going to go march to an ICE office and blow up the ICE office. Well, I would go, okay, I agree with you on the reform, but now you've gone to a space I will refuse to go to. So this is the hard part of Christian ethics, is kind of finding in the broader world, see where you fit. Now, does religion, is religion behind violence? Yeah, I mean, history shows that. But secular people are pretty violent too. Look at Stalinist Russia. Look at Pol Pot in Cambodia. Atheists can be as cruel as anybody. The sad thing is when cruelty is used or uses religion and sanctifies it, that can be terrible. But if you looked at Stalin, if you looked at Pol Pot and others, they would sanctify in the name of the revolution, or sanctify it in the name of the people. Everyone is sanctifying it somehow. You see, you can have secular religion, I think, that demands absolute obedience. You see, so I accept the critique, and the Christian church has a lot to answer for. Nazi Germany, why were the churches silent? But you had a remnant, the confessing church. Right? So that's the history of religion. So do you analyze religion and ethics just because of some bad things? Orphanages, schools, hospitals, St. Vincent's. I mean, these are Catholics. I mean, all the things that Christians do. Now with these storms on the East Coast and how all the churches are coming together and sending food and money and volunteers, you see, they're not doing politics. They're doing Christian things. Okay, so it's always a mixed bag. I can't defend the church historically. It's just impossible. But no one can defend themselves historically, basically. Yeah.
Based on something like an ethics of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you think the program of Old Testament ethics isn't offered by
Yeah.
a liberal? Is there a need for it? Like, what do we have?
Well, I don't know. Is this being recorded as well or not? Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm not saying stop. I'm just saying, do I need to repeat the question? The question is, in issues like the Human Rights Declaration, things like this, I think we can very much sign on to that. Again, we would maybe have different reasons, you see. So on the one hand is Christian participation and things like that. Okay. Another thing would be, well, what's the Christian, contribution? Well, that's hard to analyze and hard to quantify because there will be a refusal to accept part of our contribution. If they say, why do you do this? I say, well, Jesus calls me to do this. Okay, that'll be like gobbledygook to them. Okay, that's fine. I'm sorry you think it's gobbledygook, but this is why I do what I do. So they won't accept that. I think, what we find, for instance, in refugee resettlement, for instance, is that, if you know how that works, the U.S. has a quota that it negotiates. And this government, sadly, they've reduced this drastically. Apparently next year it'll be reduced to 35,000 versus 100,000 under the Obama administration. So, okay, they're reducing it. But the way the U.S. and other countries do it is, this works through the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. And they know the quotas. And so what happens in these refugee camps then is that people sign up for the countries they would like to go to, and so they get vetted by the United Nations, and then if they're chosen to come to this country, they get vetted by the U.S. government. So they get doubly vetted before they come. Once they arrive, the U.S. government contracts, usually Christian services, the Lutheran refugee program. So what you find is that the U.S. government actually uses Christian things to do things it doesn't want to do or it doesn't have time. So it's this particular Lutheran refugee service, and there are others. What they'll do, World Relief is another one. They'll help you find housing, they'll English classes, tutoring for your kids, they'll help you find a job, they'll help you, do a CV so you can try to get a job. All these things where you see the Christians kind of working that no one ever talks about. But if those Christians aren't doing relief, refugee resettlement, it doesn't happen in this country. Okay? So you have all this stuff going on, you see, where Christians are contributing to the public square that most people aren't even aware of. So I think, that needs to be brought out. And I don't have any problem when I've worked on immigration reform. I've been with people who don't agree with me theologically at all. I'm fine with that. I agree, let's work together on this, and I'm an evangelical Christian, and I'm happy to say that, and I'm not bothered if you don't like it. But I confess Jesus, and I'm doing this in the name of Jesus, and I'm okay with that. So you've got to negotiate that space. Sometimes what will happen is Christians are intimidated into silence, and they're ashamed of their faith. That's the sad part. Or what Christians will do, and I've seen this, and I've felt it as well, where let's say that you have a certain ethical thing you'd like to have happen. So let's say a political party is agreeing with you on that political issue. But that party does things that you disagree with on other issues. So you stay quiet. Or you make excuses for the things that they do that you know are wrong. And you compromise your faith so you can kind of be in the end game. I've seen that happen. I've felt that pressure. And then they'll try to negotiate with you. Well, if you agree with me on this, I can give you 2 million votes. If you agree with this and go along with me, then I can. And what they're doing is they're trying to negotiate us away from our faith. And that's where it gets really complicated. So I'm just giving you on the ground. It's complicated once you start, okay, how do we actually do this? That's why I say be careful with political parties, because there's darkness on both sides, terrible darkness. And we have to be willing to admit it. And that keeps us safe. Because once we sell our soul to the right or to the left, and I see both, and then what the right and what the left will do is excuse the extremities or the extremes of their party. Okay, look what you've just done. You've negotiated away the gospel. It gives us freedom to move in the name of Jesus. So I can say, I can work with you here, but I'm sorry, I can't agree with you over here. Or I can work with you here, and I can agree with doing certain things, but certain things you want to do, I just can't do it. That to me is just anathema to my faith. And usually what I find is they respect that. But some people get stuck on slogans, which is this country's fascinated with slogans. To our detriment, actually. Somebody else? Mm-hmm.
Sometimes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. The question is, how do you sustain hope when some things just seem to go backwards? I would say, and this is going to sound very kind of preachy, but I really mean it. Okay. I'm not called to be successful, I'm called to be faithful. And if I'm a Christian, the cross is part of my existence. At one level, I was a massive failure. Massive failure. The disciples didn't understand and they ran away. And so I think as Christians, you know, I do the best I can. I try to work with integrity. And that's all I can do. And that's where the political parties become dangerous. Because we can want the thing so badly that we're willing to negotiate some things away. Because we won't get that unless I'm going, oh, be careful. So, now what that looks like, you know, it depends on your theological tradition. So if you're Anabaptist, and I have some Anabaptist leanings, you know, I don't expect the society to get a lot better. I just don't. I mean, humans are humans. I work for change, but, you know, I think the Bible gives us a healthy realism about the nature of politics. It's us history. And so I just try to be faithful. And ultimately, you know, okay, this is going to sound really preachy, but my hope is in the Lord. I mean, I can't hope that this politician is going to save the world. Every 4 years, some politician is going to save the world. I mean, come on. And we parade our new Messiah. Okay, it's every 4 years. And I've lived in 4 countries for extended periods of time: Costa Rica, Great Britain, Guatemala, and the U.S. And I've been through election cycles in all of them. You see the same thing: the Messiah complexes. I mean, it's in every country I've been in. And then you have people, oh yes, the Messiah. And oh yes, he or she will change the world. No. That's all I can tell you. And I mean, you have these trite lines, which are really true, but they sound really trite. You know, in the end, Jesus wins. I mean, okay, that sounds so trite, but in the end, that's all we got. I mean, if you were living at the end of the first century and you have the book of Revelation, it is horrific. They're living through hell that we have no idea what that's like. People being killed and people being crucified and the persecution and being kicked out of their homes and having to flee their towns. And we have no idea what that's like. But it was the vision of chapter 20 and 21 and 22 that sustains them. It's all we have. It's all we have. Yep. Yes? Well, it depends on your theological tradition, you know, Christians and politics. So if you were to ask someone from the Reformed tradition, you'll get one answer. If you're going to talk to someone from the Anabaptist tradition, you get another answer. If you talk to someone from the Lutheran tradition, you get another answer. So if you're in the Reformed tradition, it's the cultural mandate: Jesus is Lord. So we're going to make this into a Christian culture. It's Geneva all over again, right? It's Cromwell's experiment in Great Britain. It's the colonial, right, with the Mayflower and all these things in New England. You know, we're going to make this a Christian country. That's the Reform view. Bring everything under the lordship of Christ, including the government. You know, so Abraham Kuyper in the Netherlands, who becomes prime minister, and all, you know, the Kuyperian movement within the Reformed tradition. Well, if you're a Lutheran, Luther says something, you know, I think, okay, I'm showing my bias, correct, I think, where he says, In a fallen world, how can you ever expect to have a Christian government? That's a non sequitur. And I tend to agree. So he says, so if you're Reformed, I'm sorry. But anyway, that's what he says. So he says, but Christians can have a political vocation within government. So it's not that we can have a Christian government, but we can have Christians in government. Okay? To influence it, to help move it as a moral compass. Okay? That, okay, makes sense. But if you're on the Anabaptist end of things, oh, no. See, now the extreme on the Anabaptist end would be the Amish. That'd be like the extreme. So you just totally separate yourself. But see, with the Anabaptists, in the good sense of the word, they say something that is really true, I think, where they say the church is a politics. What does that mean? Well, it means that the church should embody life under Messiah. We should embody peace. We should embody understanding. We should embody commitment and sacrifice. And so we become an example of divine politics. As an example, as an alternative kingdom to the world. And so what you've just heard are three different ways of looking at Christian involvement. So when you say to me, how should Christians be involved in government? I would say, so what tradition are you? That's all I can say, because for hundreds and hundreds of years, Christians have chosen different answers to the question. And I don't know what the Church of God Anderson tradition is. I have no idea. So I have spoken in ignorance. But that's a key question. Any other questions? Still, everybody is. Okay, is that it? Yeah, it's been fun. Thanks for coming.